If your whole life came down to a single train ticket and a wild horse, would you choose escape or freedom? The November wind cut through Millfield's main street like a promise of harder times ahead. Sarah McKenna stood at the mercantile window, watching the depot clock strike 9:30, her breath fogging the glass. 3 hours until the eastbound departed for California, 3 hours to shed this frontier town like an old coat. You sure about this ticket, Mrs. McKenna? Tom Brennan's voice carried doubt as he handed her the folded passage paper. It's a long way from here to San Francisco. Sarah tucked the marriage paper deeper in her pocket, $27 and her husband's name, both feeling heavier than they should. The arrangement's been made. There's a position waiting. She lifted her chin toward the depot, a lady's companion to Mrs. Hartford. Respectable work. The white mare in the auction ring caught her eye through the window. Even from here, Sarah could see the animal's reluctance, the way she pulled against the handler's rope. The horse bore scars along her flanks, old wounds from spurs, maybe, or wire. That's Calder's prize mare, Tom said, following her gaze. Won't take a saddle, though. Been through 4 owners this season. The depot bell chimed once 9:45. Sarah pressed her palm against the cool glass. In the reflection, she saw a woman in a blue traveling dress, hatbox under her arm, ready to disappear into someone else's life. Behind the reflection, the white horse stood perfectly still, watching the crowd gather. She's beautiful, Sarah murmured. Beautiful, don't pull a plow or carry a rider, Tom replied. Calder's lucky if he gets $10 for her. The auctioneer raised his voice over the morning bustle. Sarah found herself walking toward the ring, hatbox swinging at her side. The marriage paper crinkled in her pocket, with each step proof of a life that had ended 6 months ago when fever took James, leaving her with his debts and his name and precious little else. The mare's ears swiveled towards Sarah's approach. Up close, the scars looked different, not from cruelty, but from escape attempts. This horse had fought for her freedom and bore the marks of it. Lot 17, the auctioneer called. Fine breeding mare, suitable for cart or saddle work. The first bid came at $5. The mare tossed her head, whites showing in her eyes. Sarah felt something tight in her chest, loosen, watching the animal's defiance. $6, called a voice from the back. 7, counted another. The depot whistle shrieked. 10:15. 1 hour and 45 minutes. Sarah's fingers traced the edges of her train ticket through her coat. Mrs. Hartford would be waiting in California, expecting a quiet widow named McKenna who would pour tea and read aloud and never cause trouble. $8? The auctioneer prompted. Surely worth 8 for those bloodlines. Silence stretched between the bidders. The mare stood motionless now, her gaze fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made the crowd seem to fade. In that moment, Sarah saw herself in the animal's eyes, valuable on paper, unwanted in practice, carrying scars from someone else's expectations. The hammer rose, going once for $8. Sarah's hand moved to her pocket, fingers closing around the marriage paper. $27, her entire stake in this world. Going twice. The train ticket felt sharp against her palm. California. Safety. A life lived in other people's parlors, reading other people's books, dreaming other people's dreams. The hammer began its descent. $27, Sarah called out, her voice cutting through the morning air like the depot bell. The transaction took 18 minutes by the depot clock. Sarah signed papers with hands that barely trembled, trading her husband's name for ownership of an animal that had never been owned. The seller, a weathered man named Calder, counted her bills twice. You bought yourself a handful of trouble, ma'am, he said, pocketing the money. That mare's got a mind of her own. Sarah took the lead rope, feeling the weight of choice settle on her shoulders. The white horse stood quietly now, but tension hummed through the rope like telegraph wire. What's her name? Never gave her one that stuck. Calder tipped his hat. She's yours to figure out. The depot whistle screamed once 11 o'clock. 30 minutes until departure. Sarah looked toward the platform where her trunk waited, then at the horse who watched her with dark, knowing eyes. Come on, she whispered to the mare. Let's see what we're made of. The walk to Miller's livery took them past the post office, where Sarah paused to study the wanted notices and territorial maps tacked to the board. The mare stood patient beside her, breath steaming in the cold air, looking for something particular. The postmaster emerged from the office, mail sack in hand. Information about the territory north of here, Sarah said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. Homestead. Opportunities. The man's eyebrows rose. That's hard country, miss. Winter comes early, stays late. Take a sturdy husband and a stronger constitution to make it work. Sarah's fingers found the marriage paper in her pocket, proof of a husband who'd never been sturdy enough for anything. What about a woman alone? Well, the postmaster scratched his beard. There's talk of a schoolteacher position up in Cedar Ridge. Town's been advertising for months, but no takers. $40 a month plus board. $40. More than she'd make in California, pouring tea for Mrs. Hartford. Sarah memorized the details as the depot bell tolled 11:15. At Miller's Livery, she negotiated for a saddle and bridle $7 from her dwindling funds. The stable owner, a compact woman named Ruth Miller, watched Sarah work with the mare. She's testing you, Ruth observed as the horse sidled away from the saddle, deciding if you're worth her trust. Sarah moved slowly, letting the mare smell the leather. Her touch gentle but persistent. The animal's scars told stories here. A cut from barbed wire. There, the mark of an ill-fitted harness. Someone had tried to break this horse the hard way. Easy, Sarah murmured, her hand steady on the mare's neck. Nobody's going to hurt you here. The saddle settled into place without drama. The mare's ears flicked forward, not submission, but consideration. Ruth nodded approvingly. You've got the touch. That horse hasn't worn leather in 6 months. The depot whistle shrieked, twice 11:30. Time was a river now, rushing toward a decision that would remake everything. Sarah led the mare into the yard, her movements deliberate despite the clock's urgency. The bridle slipped on easier than expected. Sarah gathered the reins, one foot in the stirrup, and paused. Through the livery fence, she could see the depot platform, her trunk, a dark spot among the waiting passengers. The mare stood rock-still, waiting. Sarah swung into the saddle. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Not horse, not rider, not the world itself. Then the mare took one step forward, then another, and Sarah felt something she'd almost forgotten. The sensation of going somewhere by her own choice. Where to? Ruth called from the fence. Sarah looked north, where the road disappeared into timber and snow-heavy clouds. Cedar Ridge, she said, the words tasting like freedom. We're going to Cedar Ridge. The depot bell tolled 11:45 as Sarah McKenna rode out of Millfield on a white horse that had never been broken, leaving behind a trunk full of someone else's dreams and a train ticket to someone else's life. 5 miles north of town, the road forked beside a frozen creek. Sarah dismounted to rest the mare and study the hand-drawn map Ruth Miller had sketched on brown paper. Cedar Ridge lay 20 miles through rough country, following deer trails and logging roads that might or might not exist under the snow. The white horse picked her way to the creek's edge, testing the ice with one careful hoof. Sarah watched the animal's precision, the way she read the world through hooves and instinct. No rushing, no wasted motion, just the steady intelligence of something that had learned to survive on its own terms. Sarah pulled the marriage paper from her pocket, unfolding the document that had defined her for 3 years. Mrs. James McKenna, it read in careful script. Wedded this 15th day of October, 1884, in the presence of God and witnesses. The paper felt thin between her fingers, like something that had never been quite real. James had been a good man, gentle, hard-working, full of plans that never quite materialized. But she had lived in his shadow, spoken his name, dreamed his dreams until she'd almost forgotten she had her own. The mare lifted her head from the creek, water droplets freezing on her whiskers. She looked at Sarah with dark eyes that seemed to hold a question. I don't know what to call myself either, Sarah said aloud. The words hung in the cold air, visible as breath. Sarah McKenna was someone's wife. Sarah Collins that was someone's daughter. But out here, she looked at the paper again, then at the map, then at the horse who had chosen trust over fear. The afternoon sun slanted through bare branches, casting shadows that moved like possibilities across the snow. We'll figure it out together, Sarah decided. She folded the marriage paper carefully, not to discard, but to preserve. Part of her story, but not the end of it. The mare stepped close, breath warm against Sarah's cheek. In that moment, Sarah understood something about belonging. It wasn't about papers or names or other people's expectations. It was about standing in the right place at the right time and choosing to stay. She remounted, settling deeper into the saddle. The road to Cedar Ridge stretched ahead, uncertain and demanding, but for the first time in months, Sarah felt the pull of something larger than fear. "Come on, girl," she said to the horse. "Let's go find our names." The first snow began falling as they climbed towards Cedar Ridge, fat flakes that clung to the mare's mane and gathered in the folds of Sarah's coat. By late afternoon, the world had turned white and quiet, broken only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the creak of saddle leather. The town appeared suddenly through the trees, a collection of wooden buildings huddled around a single main street, smoke rising from chimneys like prayers against the cold. Sarah counted maybe 40 structures, including what looked like a schoolhouse at the far end of town. The mare's ears pricked forward as they approached the first building, a combination store and post office with territorial mail painted on a weather-beaten sign. Sarah dismounted, her legs stiff from the long ride, and tied the horse to the hitching rail. Inside, the warmth hit her like a physical thing. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat from the center of the room, surrounded by shelves of dry goods and the smell of coffee and tobacco. Behind the counter stood a man with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that took in every detail of her appearance. "Afternoon," he said carefully. "Don't believe we've met." "Sarah Collins," she replied, the name feeling strange but right in her mouth. "I heard you might have need of a school teacher." The man's expression shifted. "You're the one answered our advertisement? I'm here to apply for the position." He extended a weathered hand. "Jeremiah Stone, postmaster and town council chairman. We'd about given up hope of finding someone before winter set in proper." Stone poured coffee from a pot on the stove, his movements deliberate. "What's your experience with teaching, Miss Collins?" Sarah accepted the cup, grateful for the warmth. "I taught for 2 years in Kansas before I married. Grades 1 through 8, 43 students." The lie came smoothly close enough to truth to feel solid. She had helped at the Millfield school when the regular teacher took ill. References? Sarah pulled a letter from her coat, hastily written that morning by Ruth Miller, who'd signed it as R.M. Brennan, superintendent of schools. The handwriting was careful, the paper properly formal. "I can provide others if needed." Stone read the letter twice, his expression unreadable. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, coating the windows with white. "The position pays $40 a month," he said finally, "plus room and board with the widow Patterson. School runs October through May, with 2 weeks off at Christmas." He paused. "It's hard country, Miss Collins, harder than most women can handle." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "I'm still here, Mr. Stone." A smile cracked his weathered face. "That you are." He reached behind the counter and produced a brass key. "Schoolhouse is yours, then. Mrs. Patterson lives in the White House with the green shutters. Tell her I sent you." Sarah pocketed the key, feeling its weight like an anchor. "When do I start?" "Monday morning, 8 sharp." Stone glanced toward the window. Weather permitting. Outside, the mare stood patient in the falling snow, her white coat making her nearly invisible against the accumulating drifts. Sarah untied the lead rope, her fingers clumsy with cold and excitement. The widow Patterson proved to be a compact woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. She welcomed Sarah with hot soup and a warm room under the eaves, asking few questions about her past or her reasons for coming to Cedar Ridge. "Teaching's lonely work up here," she said as they sat by her kitchen fire. "Children are good company, but they go home at day's end. You'll want to find your place in the community." Sarah nodded, watching the snow swirl past the window. "The horse will need stabling. Miller's got space behind the store. $1 a month, including hay." Mrs. Patterson ladled more soup into Sarah's bowl. "She's a fine-looking animal. Not many folks travel this country on horseback, especially this time of year. She's particular about who rides her," Sarah said. We suit each other. That night, Sarah lay in a narrow bed under a slanted roof, listening to the wind drive snow against the windows. The marriage paper rested in her trunk, creased but preserved. Tomorrow she would unlock the schoolhouse door with her own key, stand before a classroom as Sarah Collins, teacher. The white mare nickered softly from Miller's stable across town, a sound that might have been contentment or simply acknowledgement that they had both found shelter in the storm. Monday morning arrived crisp and clear, the storm having passed in the night. Sarah walked to the schoolhouse through snow that squeaked under her boots, the brass key solid in her palm. Behind her, the town was waking smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of axes splitting kindling, the low of cattle in distant pens. The schoolhouse stood at the end of Main Street like a promise. Sarah unlocked the door and stepped inside, breathing the smell of chalk dust and old books. 16 desks arranged in neat rows, a teacher's platform at the front, a blackboard that had seen better days but would serve. By 8:15, 13 children had gathered, ranging from 6-year-old twins with matching braids to a lanky 15-year-old who towered over the rest. They watched Sarah with curious eyes as she wrote her name on the blackboard in careful script. "Good morning," she said, turning to face them. "I'm Miss Collins, your new teacher." The morning passed in a blur of introductions, assessments, and the gentle chaos of establishing routine. Sarah divided the children into groups by age and ability, setting the older ones to help the younger with reading while she worked with each level in turn. During lunch, she walked to Miller's store to check on the mare. The horse stood calm in her stall, hay scattered around her feet, a picture of contentment that made Sarah's chest warm with satisfaction. "She's settling in well," Miller observed, leaning against the stall door. "Not many horses adapt that quick to a new place." Sarah rubbed the mare's neck, feeling the trust that had grown between them. "She knows when she's home." The afternoon brought its own rhythm. Sarah discovered that young Tommy Henderson couldn't see the blackboard from his back row seat, that Mary Stone had a gift for arithmetic that far exceeded her 8 years, that the older boys tested boundaries with the careful deliberation of young men learning their place in the world. At day's end, as the children bundled into coats and scarves, Mary Stone approached Sarah's desk with something hidden behind her back. "Miss Collins," she said shyly, "I made you something." The girl produced a small wooden horse, carved with surprising skill and painted white. The proportions were perfect, down to the alert ears and lifted tail that spoke of spirit rather than submission. "She looks just like your mare," Mary said. "Papa helped with the painting, but I did the carving myself." Sarah turned the little horse in her hands, seeing not just the craftsmanship, but the observation, the attention, the gift of being truly seen. "She's beautiful. Mary, thank you." That evening, Sarah sat in Mrs. Patterson's parlor grading arithmetic papers by lamplight, the carved horse on the table beside her. Through the window, she could see snow beginning to fall again. Not the fierce storm of 3 days past, but the gentle, steady snow of deep winter settling in to stay. "You did well today," Mrs. Patterson said from her chair by the fire. "The children took to you. That's not always easy, especially for someone new to town." Sarah looked up from her papers. "They're good children. Bright, most of them. Hungry to learn. Their parents will be pleased to hear it." The older woman's knitting needles clicked steadily. "There's a town meeting Friday night. You should come, meet the families properly." Friday evening found the entire town packed into the schoolhouse, farmers and merchants, mothers with babies, old-timers who'd seen the territory grow from wilderness to settlement. Sarah stood at the front of the room where she'd taught that morning, nervous but determined. Jeremiah Stone called for order with his postmaster's authority. "First item of business, our new teacher, Miss Sarah Collins." The murmur of conversation died as Sarah stepped forward. In the lamplight, she could see familiar faces, parents of her students, townspeople she'd met in passing, the steady, weathered features of people who'd chosen this hard country and made it home. "I want to thank you for welcoming me to Cedar Ridge," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Your children are a credit to this community. They're eager to learn, respectful, and full of the curiosity that makes teaching a joy rather than a burden." Heads nodded throughout the room. Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes at the mention of her Tommy. I know some of you have questions about my background, my reasons for coming here. Sarah's hand found the carved horse in her pocket, its smooth surface warm against her palm. The truth is, I came here running from one life and hoping to find another. The woman who left Millfield 3 weeks ago was someone's widow, carrying someone else's name and someone else's dreams. The room was perfectly still now, even the babies quiet in their mother's arms. But the woman standing before you tonight chose her own name, earned her own place, and intends to make this town her home for as long as you'll have her. Sarah lifted her chin, meeting their eyes without flinching. I am Sarah Collins, teacher of Cedar Ridge, and I give you my word that I will serve your children in this community to the best of my ability. The silence stretched for a heartbeat, then another. Then Jeremiah Stone began to clap, slow and steady, and the sound spread through the room until the schoolhouse rang with applause. After the meeting, as families filed out into the cold night, Mary Stone tugged at Sarah's skirt. Miss Collins, what's your horse's name? I never heard you say. Sarah looked down at the girl's expectant face, then toward the window where snow continued to fall like stars. Somewhere across town, a white mare stood in a warm stall, no longer fighting ropes or saddles, no longer afraid of human hands. Freedom, Sarah said, the word coming from somewhere deep and certain. Her name is Freedom. Mary smiled and skipped away to join her parents, leaving Sarah alone in the empty schoolhouse with the echo of her own voice and the weight of a future she had chosen for herself. Outside, the church bell tolled 9 o'clock, marking time in a town that had become home for a woman who had finally found her name. Spring came late to Cedar Ridge, but when it arrived, it brought wildflowers that painted the meadows in bright patches of color. Sarah stood in the schoolhouse doorway, watching her students chase butterflies during recess, their laughter carrying on the warm air. The carved wooden horse sat on her desk, polished smooth by countless handlings. Beside it, a letter from California Mrs. Hartford, still seeking a lady's companion, wondering what had become of the widow McKenna who'd failed to claim her train ticket. Sarah had written back, politely declining the position and recommending another woman from Millfield who needed the work more. She'd signed the letter Sarah Collins, teacher, and felt the rightness of it settle in her bones like contentment. Freedom grazed in the meadow behind the school, her white coat gleaming in the afternoon Sunday. The mare had grown sleek over the winter, her ribs no longer showing, her scars faded to silver lines that spoke of survival rather than defeat. Miss Collins? Tommy Henderson approached with a wildflower bouquet clutched in his grubby fist. These are for you, for being the best teacher ever. Sarah accepted the flowers with appropriate ceremony, breathing their sweet scent. Through the schoolhouse window, she could see the town that had become home, the post office where Jeremiah Stone sorted mail and offered wisdom in equal measure, Mrs. Patterson's house with its green shutters and welcoming kitchen, Miller's store where Freedom waited patiently for their evening rides. The marriage paper rested in her trunk now, no longer hidden but not forgotten, a bridge between who she had been and who she'd chosen to become. Sometimes the past was a foundation rather than a prison. As the children returned to their lessons, Sarah looked once more at the meadow, where a white horse grazed in freedom, where wildflowers bloomed in defiance of harsh winters, where a woman had found her name by choosing it for herself. The afternoon stretched ahead, full of irregular verbs and long division, of questions asked and answered, of young minds reaching toward knowledge like flowers toward Sunday. It was ordinary work, daily work, the kind of small miracle that built communities one lesson at a time. Sarah Collins smiled and turned back to her classroom, leaving the door open to let the spring air carry the sound of learning into the world. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.